All right, whilst everyone is starting to drop into the webinar, I'm going to start with some brief introductions. Firstly, I'd like to welcome you all. It's great to have so many of you online during work hours, and I'm very confident this will be a good investment of your time today. Today's webinar is a direct result of the feedback we've received from you, from our member surveys and conversations. So thanks for sharing your thoughts with us. We're definitely directed by what's important for you. So for anyone who I haven't met as yet, I'm Roxy Kruger. My role at IVA stretches across many areas of what we do, so feel free to reach out to me at any time if there's something you need. But most importantly, I have the pleasure of welcoming probably one of the most energetic webinar hosts, Paolo Lencioni. Paolo, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thanks for the introduction, Roxy. I'm not sure. I'm not too sure I deserve it.
Well,
thanks.
I've never been at a conference session before where I've had to do burpees, so I think you've claimed that very well.
Oh, I won't be getting anyone to do burpees now because I can't supervise it, and I don't think I can do that with the headset right.
They're not so safe. So I'm sure most of you have already come across Paolo at some stage. It's really exciting to have 60 minutes with Paolo because he has a really unique background. So as a veterinary surgeon, he's done some work in accounting. He's also owned a veterinary practice. He's worked in software consulting and in the pharmaceutical industry as well. So IVA is really proud to be partnered with Paolo's business, Profit Diagnostics, which a number of our members are using, and also APL Accountants. So Paolo, I'll probably start by asking a bit of a loaded question. There's probably a huge range of lists and things that practice owners and managers should be doing or should be measuring in their practices. But what's the real upside of what we're going to go through with you over the next 60 minutes?
Okay, so basically, I think a lot of business owners do suffer from paralysis by analysis. So they do actually look at too many things. That's quite important. If you're looking at too much, you're not going to act on anything. So when I think I first did this presentation for you guys about a year ago, and you guys said, "Oh, let's speak about the 5 most important KPIs." And I thought to myself, well, what would those be? And because we consult hands-on with sort of about 140 veterinary practices at any point in time, we actually have a dashboard called the Business Health Check. And that incidentally has got 5 things on it. And that is my first go-to when I first pick up a customer and like I've never seen their business before and looked at their numbers before. That's my go-to for immediately identifying if there's a serious problem in that business. And that's what I'm going to discuss today. Is I'm going to discuss the 5 most important KPIs that are on that health check report. And if then the thing is, if you see something significantly wrong in that, then you can drill down further and look at more specific things. Like, for example, if you've got a low average invoice value, you might find that then you want to drill down into each individual vet because it might be a couple of individuals in the practice that are underbilling, not all of them. So things like that. So today we'll focus on those 5 important things, and I believe probably. I would say about 70% of veterinary practices don't have access to this information, which is what's frightening.
Yeah, right. Okay. Well, that's good. And I think that everyone really wants to focus on the low-hanging fruit, so to speak, focus the energy where it's going to be beneficial rather than, as you say, looking at things that are not needed. So everyone that's online, you'll see a Q&A box on your screen. So feel free to add questions as you think of them throughout the next 60 minutes. We'll circle back to them towards the end. I'm going to do a recording. I'll send it out to everyone. So Paolo, I will turn off my screen and hand over to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Roxy. Yes, I'll take it over from here. No problem. Thanks, Roxy. Okay, guys, so thanks for attending this. What I'll do is I'll keep an eye on the Q&A box because Roxy has said that. I'll also keep an eye on the chat box. In Zoom, if you guys want to ask a question or chat, just hover your mouse at the bottom of the Zoom screen. You'll see a little menu pops up there, and there's one called Q&A and one called chat. You can use either of those. I'll keep an eye on those things. And if you guys want to ask a question, I might answer as I go if there's any questions that come up. So I'll share my screen now and we'll just go through the presentation, but we can keep it fairly informal and you don't have to just sit there and listen to me. As I say, if you want to ask something, etc., please feel free to do that. So I call these my fabulous 5 actually, and these are the 5 most important KPIs. But I guess from a standing from your perspective, one has to think of like, how do we get these things? How did we used to get these kind of metrics, and how did we sort of figure out where practices were sort of 10 years ago, and how we can do it now? And really, sort of, how did we work stuff out in the past? Okay, and it's still done this way in fairly mainstream ways. Is what we used to do, even as an accounting firm when we started APL Accountants, now probably nine or more years ago, was at the end of every financial year when we were preparing the financials for a veterinary practice, we'd send out the dreaded questionnaire, which was about, I think it was about 15 pages long, and asked a whole lot of questions about the practice, like what's the number of consults you're doing, what's the number of repeat consultations you're doing, how many active clients do you have, all these sort of questions. We then get all the questionnaires back. We put them in a spreadsheet or some kind of software that aggregated and worked out all the averages, and then we present a set of KPIs at the end of the year. So there was some issues with this, obviously, and like, I don't know if you guys want to think about some of the issues you'd have with this, you feel free to type them in the chat and see if you can get them up before I get them up. But when you think about it, like, what are the problems with manually aggregating data like that and then sending it off? And the first question is sort of how often can you actually do that? And realistically, not enough, because we know if a business is doing something wrong, for example, they're not getting enough vaccinations and they're filling in a questionnaire once a year, and we detect that their vaccinations they're under-servicing on vaccinations, then we say, okay, well, let's implement a few strategies to improve this. And then we wait a further year to get the information again. We figure out, okay, well, what you did for the last 365 days hasn't worked. So the feedback's not quick enough. And by that point, the practice, if you're doing badly on vaccinations, that practice has possibly lost between $40,000 and $60,000 per full-time vet equivalent, not only from vaccinations, but from the flow-on of work. So it can't be done often enough. So realistically, you want a minimum of looking at key metrics at least once a month. The other thing is consistency. We'd also noticed that when we got someone to fill in our questionnaire, the one year, the values that came back looked like one thing, and then when we got it back the next year, it looked quite different because a different staff member had completed that questionnaire. So we even started sending the questionnaire twice to get 2 different people at the practice to fill it in, and we get vastly different results. And that was driven by the fact that different people were using different reports in the practice management software, and there's no consistency in the practice management software that actually defines what's what. So we knew all these manual surveys were marred with inaccuracy, not necessarily because they weren't the logic behind them wasn't sound, but because the data that was initially submitted to the survey was incorrect. So really looking at that, so how long does it take to get the information? It's a huge drain on your time to fill in a 15 or 20-page questionnaire. You're not going to do it. You're not going to do it often enough. The consistency, different people filling in the same questionnaire from the same practice on the same day will send back a different questionnaire with completely different results. The accuracy, how variable are reports from different practice management systems? We know, for example, that one practice management system might report that you've got 3,000 active clients when in fact you've only got about 800. So isn't that an important KPI to know? I mean, if you don't even know how many clients you've got, then that's a huge shortcoming of your practice. And the frequency, how long do you want to do this? If it's, how long it takes to do this, and if it's inaccurate, how often can you actually do it? So we know that this is all really important, and because you're going to make expensive strategic decisions on what you see on these reports, if they're wrong, it's going to actually have a hidden cost of huge amounts of money. The classic example is that practice I spoke about earlier that thought they had 3,000 active clients, and in fact only had about 800. When we looked at the data, we thought, gee, you've got 3,000 active clients, but they're only spending about $200 a year at your practice. You're seriously underservicing these clients. And then you'd put strategies in place saying, okay, well, you've got to promote things like dentistry. Are you billing well enough? All that sort of stuff. And then finally, like a year later, you find out, no, actually, this practice only has 800 active clients. Well, you suddenly have to turn your strategies on their head, because you say, actually, your practice has too few clients. You're servicing the existing clients really, really well, and we have to put measures in place to increase your client numbers. So strategically, that practice would have wasted thousands, if not tens of thousands of dollars on implementing and training, etc., that was not relevant. So that's really, really important, is don't underestimate the hidden cost of getting the wrong information out of your practice management software. How do we measure stuff now? Okay, so what we do now, and we've started doing this about 3 years ago, is we produce some software where we install an app on the clinic server, or if it's a cloud system, connect to the cloud system, and we also connect to all the mainstream accounting software, because most practices don't have the same, their accounting software and the practice management systems, two separate bits of software, and we need information from both. So we have software that connects to both, and we actually pull in all the data from these practices every 24 hours. So in fact, for all our clients, we have updated dashboards for our clients every 24 hours. And effectively, we can monitor those clients' performance in real time. Realistically, the top level of performance we implement or feedback we do to the clients is once a week, because that's probably relevant enough for them to act on. So there's no reason why you can't have this completely automated now and save yourself heaps and heaps and heaps of time in pointlessly like data mining your practice management system. This can be done automatically. The one proviso here is your practice management software has got to agree to work with us. And at this point, we have every mainstream software provider in Australia working with us at the moment, albeit with some of them somewhat begrudgingly. Now, for those of you at this web event, and I'll put my email in here at the end of this webinar, we do realize that ownership of data is probably one of the hugest risks to the veterinary profession globally, but also in Australia at the moment. So if any of you want, we've actually, as an accounting firm, approached a legal firm, and we have a contract drafted out by a legal firm now that you can give to your software provider that guarantees access to your data. And so if any of you want that, please feel free to let me know. I'll put my email in the web event afterwards, and we're more than happy. We supply that free of charge to anyone who wants it, because we think this is such an important issue. All right, so let's go through the most important KPIs, because that's what you guys are all here for now, is for the 5 most important KPIs. And what we'll do is, because we're all vets and things, we like to do this as a case study. So we're going to look at 2 practices. I've sort of made this up, but not made this up. I'll explain that in a second. We'll assume practice A is on RxWorks, practice B is on Vision BPM, so 2 different practice management systems, but we need to compare the 2 practices, and both of these practices are small animal only. So just to explain where this data comes from a confidentiality perspective, we can't show you guys real data because it's financial data. So what we do is randomize the data, and we have a system that creates 2 case scenarios, which are very, very similar to ones we've seen in the last 12 months. So this will be 2 cases, just so the financial aspects around this and the values behind this actually are totally relevant, but the data's been randomized and changed a little bit, so it can't be traced back to any particular practice. All right, so when we look at this, if we want to guess my number one KPI, right? And if anyone puts it in the chat box before I say it, I'll probably buy a tree for an orangutan in Borneo, right? Because we can do that with the charity we use. So if anyone can put it into the chat, then I'll do it. Otherwise, there'll be no trees for orangutan. So what do you think would be your most important KPI? Okay, and I've mentioned it, right? This is it here, okay? It's your number of active clients, okay? So it's business 101, okay? If you do not know how many clients your business has, it's probably the most important thing you need to know. If you were to sell your practice, inherently the goodwill or the value of that practice is tied to your number of clients. So it's that hidden part, or that trademarking thing that you've got for your business, and how the external public perceive you. So it is the most important thing. So here, looking at this is a Profit Diagnostics chart, but what I want to explain to you here is I want to see a couple of things here when I look at a report or a value for a practice. First thing here, so when we look at active clients here on this chart, it's the blue line, right? So you can see here on the practice on the left, practice A, they have just over 3,500 active clients. It seems to be going really well until about 6 months ago, and then the number of active clients start to dip down again. On the other one, the active clients are just under 4,000, and as the year gradually progresses, it's steadily creeping up until it hits about 4,000 active clients after 12 months. So the one thing that's really, really important and is missed in most practice management system is a trend, right? For me, knowing that a practice has 3,000 active clients isn't enough. I need to know what those active client numbers have been doing in the last 12 months. Are they going up or are they going down? Because that's equally as important to me as the number of active clients. So certainly for the practice on the left, practice A, I would be a little bit concerned as to what's been happening with their active clients in the last 12 months, because the line is starting to go down again. And for the practice on the right here, I'm quite happy with their trend in active clients because their client numbers have gradually been going up. The question then is, how are these calculated? And this again is where the reports you're getting are not standardized. I'm not saying it's wrong, but when we're trying to compare apples with apples, different practice management systems will have a different definition for an active client. So the way we define an active client is a client that has been invoiced a positive dollar value in the last 12 months. Okay, and that applies consistency, so we can compare a practice using Vision, a practice using RxWorks, a practice using EasyVet. At least we have a constant definition. All right, and then we have a question: how many active clients should there be per full-time vet equivalent? You've jumped the gun. Okay, that's going to be my next KPI is active clients per full-time vet equivalent. So we'll come to that one. So here. We know what the definition of active client is, so it doesn't matter what we look at. We like to use a 12-month period, positive dollar invoice value. When you look at practice management systems, some practice management systems count clinical notes. So if you add a clinical note to a client, they become active. So you might type, client hated receptionist is never coming back, hit enter, and then that client is classed as active because there's been a clinical note added. Some practices count refunds, some practices count as $0 invoices, because a lot of practice management systems will raise a $0 invoice every time you raise a clinical note. So practice management systems do this very, very inconsistently. So at least here we have consistency and we can compare apples with apples. So that's how your active clients are calculated. And yes, based on that question, my number 2 KPI is, it's great to know a practice has got 3,500 or 4,000 active clients, but is that too many or is it too few active clients? And the reality, or the question you asked then is, well, it depends how many staff they've got, how many full-time vet equivalents they've got. Because now that I know my active clients, and bear in mind that a lot of these KPIs I'm going to speak to you about today require that you know active clients accurately. If you don't know your active clients accurately, which a lot of you don't, then you can't measure the other ones accurately. Right, so next one is active clients for full-time vet equivalent, right? And again, this is just the same as that chart before, except now we have a little table here. So this is the number of active clients. So this is practice A, practice B, same practice as we saw in the previous charts. So you can see here, this one here, the active clients were 3,452. Then they peaked at about 3,569, and then they started coming down again. And here we have their active clients per full-time vet equivalent. So we can see here they were in about 800s to start with about 12 months ago, and now they're about 728. And that's basically taking their number of full-time vet equivalents and dividing the active clients by that. In the practice on the right here, this one here, the active clients were about 3,800 12 months ago. Now they're 3,993, so there's been a really, really steady increase. But when we actually divide that by the number of full-time vet equivalents, we can see a significantly lower number than the other practice, right? But these guys are running between 587 and 561 active clients per full-time vet equivalent. So, so there is a big discrepancy here. So the question now is, and this is the other thing I really need to know when I'm looking at a practice, and we're quite happy to share these values with people, is how many active clients per full-time vet equivalent is the right number for a veterinary practice in Australia. And we know this number by the virtue of the fact that between our valuation business, our Profit Diagnostics business, and our hands-on consultancy, we deal with hands-on in excess of 200 veterinary practices a year. We know their numbers and we can average it out. And the average veterinary practice has about between 640 and 660 active clients per full-time vet equivalent. Okay, so here we can see in this practice here, the one here on the left-hand side here, I think left and right are the same for you guys, by the way. They might be inverted on Zoom though. But the practice here on the left is running between 800 and 700. So in spite of their dropping number of active clients, they still have more than enough clients per full-time vet equivalent. So it's not panic stations here yet. There's something wrong happening, but it's certainly not got so bad to a degree that they can't make money out of this. All right, whereas the practice here on the right, running in the 500s, is running significantly lower than the national average. We'd like to see at least, you know, another almost 100 active clients per full-time vet. So they are running a little bit low. Now, we know that, and just because I've seen a lot of data of this nature, we do know that there's high net profit margin practices actually operating in the 500s, but they have to be really, really good at service promotion. So keep in mind when we actually look at what's wrong with these two practices, how we're going to fix these problems, because I'll go through the 5 most important KPIs, and at the end, we'll come up with a diagnosis, and we'll be able to see what sort of treatment plan we can put in place for these practices. All right, so that's my number 2, active clients per full-time vet equivalent. How is this calculated? I guess the important part here is just knowing how a full-time vet equivalent is calculated. In our software, it's done slightly differently, but for the purposes of you guys who might be wanting to do this manually, it's quite simple. For full-time vet equivalent, just look at the physical vet bodies you have in the practice. Every 38-hour week vet is one full-time vet equivalent. So if you have 3 vets working there for 38 hours, then that's 3 full-time vet equivalents. Just the one little thing to keep in mind is you are working this out over a year because your active clients is averaged over a year, so your full-time vet equivalents is averaged over a year. If you're looking at a year's worth of employees, you might have 3 vets in the practice, but one of them has only been working for 6 months. So the vet working for 6 months is only a half full-time vet equivalent. So if you have 3 38-hour-a-week vets, but one of them's only been there for 6 months and just not replacing anyone, just come in, you added in another vet 6 months ago, then that vet is only half a full-time vet equivalent. So just bear in mind if you're doing working out your full-time vet equivalents manually. All right, so now that we know active clients per full-time vet equivalent, I can immediately see whether that practice is over-resourced or under-resourced. The practice on the left, in theory, is slightly under-resourced. They've got too few vets per full-time per active client. The practice on the right is slightly over-resourced. They've got too few clients per full-time vet equivalent. All right, so we go over to my 3rd most important KPI. All right, and this is a really good one. It's a new one we started using and it's so effective. It's average client spend. Because we know how many active clients a practice has, I'll tell you straight away how we calculate this. We know how many clients a practice has accurately now. We simply divide their sales in the year, their total revenue, by the number of active clients, and that's their average annual client spend, how much a client spends every year. And here we can see the practice on the left here. You can see we're doing it inclusive and exclusive of tax. That doesn't really matter. We'll just look at the tax inclusive value at the moment, and that's very important, obviously, including GST. 10% makes all the difference when it comes to profit. This one here is on about 787. And this one here is on about 658. So we can see immediately here there is a significant disparity between what each client is spending in the practice each year. I also put in here, because we do measure this and we always look at these two together, we also look at their average invoice value. And this practice, it's $201. In this practice, it's $154. And the reason why we look we always, average invoice value was a value that I think if you've done any surveys or done any sort of management workshops in the past, people have always looked at average invoice value, as well as us up till about 3 years ago, as a really, really good indicator on whether a practice is pricing accurately. In other words, are they underpricing, because that would drop average invoice value? Are they misbilling? Is their billing inaccurate? So if there's misbilling, their average invoice value will drop. And are they promoting enough services like dentistry and blood testing? Because if they don't promote enough high-value services, their average invoice value will drop. And for those 3 sort of problems, we would say, okay, average transaction is a really, really good indicator of those things. But our argument is that average client spend is far more accurate than average invoice value for detecting those 3 problems. And the reason why we say that is we became aware in practices that something we call invoice splitting. And the classic scenario is for some practices, if a patient is hospitalized with a tick paralysis, say for 7 days, then one practice will actually raise a single invoice for that particular patient at the end of the 7 days, whereas another practice might say, well, let's like interim bill the client and actually raise an invoice every single day and keep the client updated every single day where the fees are. So they'll actually raise 7 invoices for that same patient. So you can immediately see that the practice that splits the bill into 7 smaller invoices, that's going to definitely affect their average invoice value. So that sort of thing made average invoice value slightly inaccurate. So nowadays what we do is we always look at average client spend and average invoice value. So still looking at the same 2 cases, we haven't changed anything. We've got the practice on the left, which is the one where the client numbers going up and then down again, but they've still got a lot of clients. In this particular case, we can see their average client spend is 787 inclusive of tax. Now, where should this be? That's the other question we're asking all the time is, okay, we know it's 787. Is that high or is that low? And I can tell you now that the national average for average client spend, inclusive of GST, is around $800. So they ballpark figure just under where they should be with average client spend. Their average invoice value is $201, inclusive of tax. We know the national average is around $155, $156. So their average invoice value is actually quite high. So if I put the two of those together, I'm happy that their billing is okay. It could probably be better, but I'm happy that there's not any serious misbilling or service under promotion issues at this particular practice. If I look at the practice on the right here, you can see quite a different picture. We can see that their average client spend is $658. So this is a significant amount. When you consider it's over about 4,000 clients, you can start to do the maths in your head, and we'll actually have a slide on what difference it makes. And we can see their average invoice value is about $154, so about $2 under what we'd expect it to be. So in this case, I would be sort of looking at, okay, this practice does have either a billing problem, a pricing problem, or a service promotion problem. They're either not promoting enough high-value services, the vets are either forgetting to put stuff on the invoices, or they're simply not pricing enough for things that they're doing, right? And this is going to be costing them a lot of money. So looking at that and the opportunity cost, so this practice here, so it was happy times for them with their client numbers. Remember, their client numbers were going up, but their resourcing was low. Their clients per full-time vet was low, so they didn't have enough clients for the number of staff they had, and their average client spend is also low. So they've got a problem with those things. Okay, we can start to see that the two practice profiles are quite different from each other. So if we were to look at the opportunity cost to that practice, and like I said in the beginning, it's randomized data, but the numbers you see here are within 10% of the actual case study. So if we look at what happened here, they had 3,963 clients. The spend shortfall was at least $100. They were at least $100 under the less than the other practice, and certainly more than $100 less than the national average client spend. So we simply multiply the number of clients by the shortfall in the average client spend, and their amount of under-servicing is costing them almost $400,000 a year. Okay, so you can immediately start to see the power of this. If I can say now without a doubt to a practice like, oh, maybe the data's wrong, maybe the data's right, I can say without a doubt to these guys, you have a problem in one of these three areas. Either you're misbilling, your prices are too low, or you're under promoting services. Okay, and that's a stage where we say, okay, well, then we'll possibly start to dig a little bit deeper beyond the 5 most important KPIs. Okay, so average client spend, very, very powerful one. So remember that one. Okay, my number 4 most important KPI is this one here, what we call client-facing opportunities. And these charts, we have a dashboard actually. All these charts will come up on one page, so I can quickly scan through these. Normally on a new client, I'll look at these. It takes me about 2 minutes, and I can make these assumptions we're making. We're taking a whole webinar over it now, but we can normally make these assumptions in about 2 minutes. Again, the same two practices, the one on the left and on the right, same two practices. I'm looking at client-facing opportunities, and the reason why I think client-facing opportunities are so important is if the number of times the client is standing in a consult room with a vet is so important, because it's every time that happens, it's a chance to detect an additional skin case, look at their teeth and see if they need a dental, look in their ears and see if they've got an otitis externa or something like that. So your client-facing opportunities are so important. And your client-facing opportunities, we class them as your primary consultations, repeat consultations, and vaccinations, because those are your mainstream areas where a vet is standing in a consult room with a client. And again here, the really important thing you can see here, as you'll hear this again, I need a trend, right? I need to know how things are happening from a trend perspective for a practice. So here you can see I have a trend, and here I have a 2-year trend here. And then I have a target or a national average. The green line is actually showing where the national average practice of that size is. And so for all these things, I have a trend and I have a target, so I can see what's happening over a period of time. So remember, this practice here on the left was the one where the client numbers, things were going great, clients were going up, and then they were going down again. And I can quite clearly see that this is affecting their client-facing events. Look at their primary consultations, happy days going up, and then starting to drop down. So I know that this drop in client numbers is real. I know that it's actually affecting their number of client-facing events, and as a result, I know it will affect their bottom line. Exactly the same profile in the repeat consultations, up, level off a little bit here, doing really well there, and then suddenly bang, under average and starting to drop here. Now, don't worry about this last data point, right? When I actually produced this report, the month here of September wasn't actually, we were only the first week in the month of September. So just ignore that one, okay? Because if I saw that, I'd actually have a heart attack. So assume it stops here in August, right? But you can actually see here how the repeat consults came down. And same thing happened with the vaccinations. You can see how they went up, had a really good high point there, and then a slight drop in number of vaccinations there again. So I can certainly see for this practice, the number of client-facing events is certainly reflected by their drop in active clients. This other practice now, the other one, which if we remember now, things are looking great. Their client numbers are growing. They have too many, effectively have too many staff per client number, and their clients aren't spending enough at their practice. This really surprises me, right? Because here we can see they've got the number of primary consultations is way above the average practice. They're doing tons of primary consultations. How on earth can these clients not be spending enough money at the practice if they're coming in that often for primary consultations? Look at the number of repeat consultations, like almost double what we'd expect. Yet this practice, the client spend is over $100 lower than what it should be, okay? And then I look at their vaccinations, and here their vaccinations are below what they should be. Okay, so there's some serious management issues going on here that are affecting the bottom line of this practice. I can almost assure you here, with this volume of consultations and repeat consultations, I could tell them with beyond a doubt that misbilling and pricing was a problem. The clients are coming in heaps. They're loving the practice. They're there all the time, but they're not being charged enough. It's either not getting on the invoice or they're not charging enough for their services, right? So that confirms that. But just on the side, immediately, because we're looking at client-facing events, we can see they're under-servicing on their vaccinations, probably by about 10%. Now, for a practice this size, this is probably $150,000 problem in vaccinations alone, and would have also affected the fact that clients aren't spending enough because they're not coming back for their vaccinations. And for this particular scenario, in fact, in any scenario where I see vaccinations are this low, my go-to place is to see how they're running their vaccination reminders. And in fact, this practice was mismanaging their vaccination reminders. So a really, really easy fix on that particular thing immediately. Okay, so here again, pretty different profile, but we're starting to get a good idea of what's happening here with these particular KPIs, and starting to, in my mind, formulate a diagnostic plan. For example, I know for sure, I know the practice on the left has got a problem with declining client numbers. We knew that from the beginning, and the declining client numbers are now causing a reduction in client-facing events, which is going to affect the bottom line. The practice on the right has most certainly got a pricing problem. They've got a vaccination problem, and that's why their average client spend is low. All right, so why do we look? People often say to me, systems like RxWorks like to measure visits, and whether it's a repeat consultation or a primary consultation or a vaccination, we should be measuring them all the same, and we should be charging a consultation every time we do a vaccination. I disagree with that, because I like to have a separate measurement for all three of those, because my belief is the drivers of those three things are significantly different. So when we look at consultations and who drives the consultations in your practice, well, that's primarily driven by your reception team, the telephone calls, your external marketing, the visibility of your practice, and yes, to some extent, whether the clients are happy seeing the vet, because they wouldn't come back if they didn't like the vet. But realistically, a lot of your primary consultations are driven by your reception and marketing, so it's a different set of people. Okay, whereas when you look at repeat consultations, who drives repeat consultations? And I would say repeat consultations are 100% driven by the veterinarian and how they book that repeat consultation in the consult room. So it's very, very important. If you've got good consultations but low repeat consultations, it's a different set of people you need to speak to. Your repeat consults are driven by your veterinary team, your primary consultations, external marketing and reception team, so your administrative team, etc. And your vaccinations, like I said earlier, are, in my belief, are completely driven by your reminder system. So how well managed that reminder system is, how many reminders you're sending out, whether or not you're sending text message reminders, which are very, very effective, because a lot of practices aren't doing that at the moment, and we know they're very, very effective. So different people have to be trained if there's a problem in each of those things. So I always like to measure them separately. So in the practice on the right that we had the example, because their vaccinations were low, my go-to place would be, let's assess their reminder system and see what that looks like. And that, as I say, 9 out of 10 cases, it's got to do with the reminder system. All right, so coming to my number 5 most important KPI now, we'd be looking at, this is an accounting one, so it's the only accounting one you have there, is wages as a percent of revenue. So all you do is you take your total revenue for the year, exclusive of GST. We normally do it from the profit and loss, so that's exclusive of GST, and we divide that by the wages of the practice. Now, it sounds quite simple, but remember, in a lot of veterinary practices, the business owner is not taking a commercial wage. So our software actually adjusts for a business owner's commercial wage automatically. But a lot of business owners, depending on what their accountant will say, might not actually take a wage at all. They'll just take a loan or drawings out of the business, and their wage never touches the payroll. And if it's a 3-vet practice and one of those vets isn't taking a wage, trust me, it makes a huge difference, almost a 10% difference in the wage percentage. So when you're looking at your wages in your profit and loss statement, if you're doing this manually, please remember, ask yourself, how many hours am I working a week? And what am I taking through payroll? So for example, you're taking $50,000 through payroll, but you're working a 38-hour week. We like to adjust or assume, we do this in the valuation business all the time, that a 38-hour week for a experienced vet who owns a business is $100,000. So in this particular case, if you're only taking $50,000, you're underpaying yourself by $50,000. So we would add $50,000 to the wages. Okay, just so everyone's clear on that. Once we've done what we call adjusted wages, so adjusted for owner's wage, this is what it looked like in the 2 practices. So in the practice on the left, the one that had the slightly declining client number and the declining number of client-facing events, we could see that their wages are at 32.8%. The other practice, on the other hand, their wages are at 51.9%. Now, bearing in mind, these are very close to real case studies. We can see, again, there's a huge disparity strategically. What are these business owners going to do? We know the practice on the left here, this is pretty good. Like, the question again is, and we're happy to share these, and they're on our dashboards, is what should your wages percent be? And when we look at wages, it's exclusive of superannuation, so it's just the wages, not the superannuation. But the average practice runs at about 39%. So we can see this practice, in terms of wages, is pretty low. It fits totally in with what we saw with their active clients per full-time vet equivalent. If you remember, they were in the 800s and came down to the 700s. It was still above average, so it showed that they had a lot of clients per vet. So that kind of stacks up. Their wages as a percent of revenue are going to be a little bit lower. The question being, am I happy with that? Is it too high? Is it too low? Knowing that the national average is 39%, we actually know for our high net profit margin practices, or 20% plus net profit margin practices, sitting at wages at about 33% is actually quite a good spot. So I'm not worried about their wages at all. I think their wages is in a pretty good place. Considering their client numbers are decreasing slightly, it's probably prudent to keep your wages slightly low. If that client drop carries on happening, you might not. You might find that, obviously your number of clients per full-time vet decrease gradually. For the other practice, on the other hand, we were aware that they had fewer active clients per full-time vet equivalent. If you remember the first slide, they were in the 500s, and national average is about 640. So here, this also stacks up. They have fewer clients per vet, and their wages are at 51.9%. So this is a huge amount of wage oversupply, considering the national average is 39%. They're paying a lot in wages in this particular practice. So the question now is what to do and how are we going to fix these practices. I now have the 5 most important KPIs, and for both these practices, essentially, strategically, all I need to know to take further steps. So looking at what we can do to take further steps there. Well, the first, so this is basically the first practice. I'll actually tell you historically, I'll tell you what actually happened with these practices. If we look at we do a master problem, let's look at the main problem here. We have a reducing client base. Their client numbers per vet are still adequate. They were still sitting in the 700s, and national average is 640, so they've got plenty of clients still. The client reduction has only started in the last 6 months. And here is where you ask the questions, you investigate, have there been new competitors opened up nearby, an aggressive new competitor, and do some market research on these competitors and follow up some of your lost, we can do a lost client follow-up, so they can find all their lost clients and chase them up and follow them up. But the reality of this practice is, yes, they did have a staff member that left and opened up a practice, but not that nearby. It was still, it was probably about 15 or 20 kilometers away, so close enough maybe to have an impact. But the main issue in this practice was revolved around roadworks. So there was a massive lot of roadworks that had been started at a road nearby, which was their main access point. And when they did start phoning up their clients and follow them up to ask them where they'd gone, the answer the common answer was, it's just too hard to get you guys at the moment. So for now, we're using another vet until these roadworks stop. So that's the true story behind that one practice. From the other practice, we can see the problem here is there's a mismatch really between the current staffing and level of service promotion. The client numbers they have are only suitable for a boutique style of practice. So like I said in the beginning of the webinar, they're running in the sort of 550 active clients per full-time vet equivalent. The national average is 640, so they're significantly lower than what they should be. We certainly see profitable practices running in the 500 active clients per full-time vet equivalent. However, those practices are what we call boutique practices, and service promotion is what they're good at. They're good at promoting all the high-value services like dentistry. They're also very good at charging because their client base wants the best service. They're happy to pay for it. Okay, so there's really a mismatch here because the likelihood here is that they're not charging adequately for that level of staffing. So they've got to try and accommodate that lower number of clients. And this was a crossroads decision we had to make with this business owner was you have to decide what kind of a practice you want. There's no right and wrong decisions. We see profitable practices on both sides of the spectrum. But do you want to be a high quality service practice, or do you want to be a high throughput practice that sees a lot of cases but doesn't necessarily charge top dollar prices and has 15-minute consults instead of 30-minute consults, that sort of thing? Bearing in mind, you cannot be both. You cannot do both those things, right? Understand that now. You cannot be a high quality, high service practice, offer everything to your clients, charge top dollar fees, and have a massive throughput of clients. You cannot do both. So this was a decision the business owner had to make, and they were quite, it didn't take them long to come with an answer. They said so immediately. They were more interested in being a high quality service practice. At which point we know now, okay, the strategies because if they decide they want to be a high throughput practice, the only option would be to lay staff off. They were overstaffed for a high throughput practice. They'd have to cut back on maybe about 15% of their staff wages, and that would automatically bring their active clients up to the high 600s. They didn't want to do that. I think it was the right decision. They decided they were going to go very, very heavy on service promotion, and we also assessed their prices. We worked out all their prices. They were undercharging, so we benchmarked all their prices: consult fees, repeat consults, vaccinations. They were underpricing. We measured their volume of dentistry, cytology, blood testing, radiography against national average. All of that was lower. So we put measures in place, and they decided it was all going to be about staff belief, staff training, getting their team on board with this. And this was actually the results. So we didn't get quite to where we thought we would, but this was in 6 months' time. 6 months later, this is what their average invoice value looked like as a trend, because I like trends. So you can see here over time, as their average invoice value gradually went over target as their pricing and billing improved. Their client spend, this was their client spend at the time of producing this here. Well, randomized within 10% of it anyway. But you can see there was around a 47 increase in client spend over 4,000 clients. So that's only really half the way where we would have wanted to get. But halfway is good enough in a short period of time. And that actually raised about about pretty much 188,000 in extra revenue. So really, it's not all profit. Obviously, there's a number of expenses related to whatever you do. But if your low client spend is due to missed billing, then it's all profit. And if it's due to high service promotion like dentistry, we know that the service component is quite high and the materials is quite low. So really, it would translate to about $30,000 or $40,000 of additional profit. So that's basically 2 case studies to show you the most important KPIs. I don't know if anyone has any further questions around that. I'm happy to answer them. I will put here, and in the chat, not in the Q&A, I'll put my email here. So that should come through to the. Did it go? No, it went. Sorry, I sent it privately to everyone. I think panelists and attendees. Here it comes again, guys. Sorry, I think I just sent that to Roxy. There we go. So that's to everyone there. That's my email address, and I'm quite happy. So if you guys want this stuff done on your actual practices, we actually do set you up. We do a 30-day free trial, so I'm more than happy. And I'll sit down and have a meeting with you guys, so I can show you this exact stuff exactly as you see them here for your own practice. If anyone's interested, feel free to let me know.
Thank you so much, Paolo. So with that 30-day free trial, what's involved from a clinic perspective?
All they have to do is email me and ask me. Then it depends what accounting software and practice management software they use. We basically just hook them up. The complexity varies, but we'll speak directly to the software company and their bookkeeper. So basically all the practice has to do is email me, copy in their bookkeeper and their software company saying we want this hooked up, and then I'll just take over the communications for you if you want. So because we know business owners are busy, so and we'll just set it up for you. So that's what's involved. Send an email to me and let the other parties' accounting software and practice management software know that that you want it done.
Yeah, okay. So one question that came to mind, inventory is a component of, something that we look into at IVA, and I know that mischarges can kind of add up over time. How much can they add up in your experience from the case studies that you've seen? I mean, at one side of things, it's, just some gauze or whatever. It doesn't seem to be a big deal, but what can it equal when you really start to dig into these charges?
I can estimate what misbilling costs. The tricky thing with misbilling is, now we know it's rife in the veterinary profession, because when we spot check invoices from various vets, we know that there can be a significant amount. As much, in worst case scenarios, about 20% of the invoice can actually be missed on a consistent basis. Okay, so that's if you spot check individual vets, but we know it's impossible to do that across the entire practice all the time. The difficult thing with misbilling is it's impossible to measure what is never recorded anywhere. And that's why it's so dangerous, because there's nothing to highlight, oh, this bill is missed. All you see is a reduction in other parameters in the practice. Like you see cost of goods sold being a bit high, you see average client spend being a bit low, you see average invoice value being a bit low. But we do know in practices where we have addressed misbilling, in some cases it's been about 15% of their revenue. And if it's a practice that's running at a 10% net profit margin, that means they were running at a loss. Because if you take 15% of revenue, it means if you take 15% of revenue, it gets rid of your entire profit margin. Yeah. So effectively, practices are running at a loss when they should be running at a 10% profit if their misbilling is really, really bad. It's probably one of the hugest problems in veterinary practice at the moment.
Right. And what kind of time frame do you see that can be turned around in if there's a concerted effort by the practice to get on top of it?
That's the key element, is the concerted effort by the practice, and how aggressively the practice owner or practice manager is prepared to implement if they can actually get the message across to their staff, if they can get the belief through to their team. Misbilling is a problem that can be fixed in 1 month. It comes down to having a few staff meetings, templating a lot of your billing in your practice management systems. Most of them do that really, really well. Where you create like a procedure or a template where, like for a surgery, it automatically bills the anesthetic, the drip, the pre-op bloods, all that sort of stuff. So people don't forget. So templated billing, and then implement in practices are really bad. Identify the vets that are bad at billing. Don't get rid of them, because a lot of them are actually really, really good vets. But just get one of the nurses to spot check their invoices periodically until they get on board. And just doing those sort of things can have a significant impact. You can do that in a month. You can implement that in a month, given the right motivations and doing it with enough vigor. You can get that right in a month.
Yeah, and I think probably it's good to have someone that's really championing it. I've been in practices before, and I've been talking with the owner, and the nurse will come in and say, you didn't charge for this and this, and the owner goes, okay, sorry, whoops. So everyone's kind of got their eyes across it, and they're working like a team.
I think tracking and measuring also works, because what I would do for a practice with misbilling, because it reacts a lot quicker, is actually monitor average invoice value every month. And you'll see the nice thing is what the business owner will do or the manager will do is they'll put a whole lot of effort into trying to fix this problem, and then they have no feedback in knowing whether or not what they've done is working or not. But if they do a whole lot of stuff with their team and the next month they see a 10% increase in average invoice value, that enough is motivational enough to be able to sit on the problem for even longer. So tracking and measuring on a regular basis is, to me, also very, very important, because just flying in the dark and doing a whole lot of stuff with your team and then not knowing whether you've got a result is quite daunting. Like, you run out of puff really, really easily. You can just get a bit of staff resistance, them throwing back some complaints at you and stuff, and you just give up really easily. Whereas if you're tracking and measuring, trust me, you just don't give up.
Yeah, that makes complete sense.
Mark's entered here and comparing vets. That's what came in the chat now, of course. Whenever I look at a missed billing problem, my go-to parameter, just by the way, is looking at average invoice value for each vet. And bearing in mind, you've got to be really careful about how you interpret that, because different roles, like if you've got a dedicated surgeon in the practice, their average invoice value is going to be a lot higher than a consulting vet. But if you have 3 vets that have similar roles, they do similar amounts of consulting and surgery, and there's a huge disparity or difference between their average invoice values, if the role is the same, you can assume that the one with the lowest average invoice value is misbilling.
And so do you help clinics as well set the KPIs per vet based on, you know, what's actually happening in the practice?
Yeah, 100%. So we focus on having so basically when we start, by default, we ship all the targets in our system are based on the national average, because our take is that if your practice is performing below the average practice with certain things like vaccinations, it's really, really easy to bring it up to what the average practice does, so you get the most return on your effort. But once practices, and there are some practices that are above average, in all of those parameters, then we have a top tier where our top sort of 20% of practices sit with all those targets, and then we incrementally just set the practices up to our top performer practices. At which point, if they hit all the targets there, they're running a 25 plus net profit margin. So we have a tiered system. Like, you can't, if you have a really good practice and set them average targets, they're actually going to get worse. So.
Yes. All right, so you've shared your email address in the chat there. So I'm going to have a recording of this sent out to everyone. I'll include your email address. So anyone, if you want to get in touch with Paolo, you'll have access to that. And I'll also include some of the details about the partnership that we have with APL Accountants and Profit Diagnostics. So you've got a bit of a background there as well.
Cool, thank you.
Now, Paolo, thank you so much for your time. It's always good to have a chat with you and to hear things from your perspective. I think it's really unique that you have such a broad background. The software and the vet and the accounting, it almost seems like it can't go together, but it does quite well.
Yeah. All right, thanks guys. Thanks for having me on the web event.
No problems, Paolo. And anyone, if you have any questions, feel free to send them through, and we'll definitely connect you with Paolo. Thank you so much.
Bye.
Bye, Paolo.